Hi, I'm Larry Castle here with Ken Brown for episode 46 of That's a Good Question. Are megachurches a good thing? Well, welcome everybody. Pastor Ken, thanks for joining again this week. And just before we get started this week, I'm going to do something a little different. I always do it at the end. I don't know how many of you are still here at the very end. So I want to remind you to, one, say thank you for watching this video. And if you don't already, subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the like on this video, hit the notification bell, all those good things so that you'll know when our new episodes come out. And thanks for joining us today. Over the last couple of weeks, Pastor Ken, we've been, the last two sessions, we've been talking about what the Bible says about the centrality of the local church. Mm-hmm. And we know that churches come in all flavors, shapes, and sizes. And of course, there are differences in what churches teach, the doctrine, their beliefs. Mm-hmm. But there are also important differences in not only what they teach, but how a church goes about its work. Mm-hmm. In other words, there are differences in doctrine, but there are also differences in what I learned in seminary to call philosophy of ministry. Right. And that affects the way a church operates. Just in our lifetimes, we've seen the explosion of what we call the megachurch. And that's usually defined as a church with regular attendance of 2,000 people or more. And it's such a common thing that just about everyone watching this probably lives within driving distance of one of these megachurches. Mm-hmm. So in today's episode, we want to explore the question, are megachurches a good thing? In particular, we want to consider the philosophy that tends to undergird megachurches and consider whether it lines up with what we see in the Bible.
Yeah. Well, I think you've set it up well when you say these issues of philosophy of ministry are important, and you also note that there is in fact a philosophy that gives rise to megachurches, and we're going to explore that then in this session and compare it to the Bible. So first, we should all consider the fact that it's not only what a church believes that's important, but also how it works, and that's dictated by, as you said, its philosophy of ministry. Now, I grant certainly that doctrine is most important, but how a church views its task and therefore, how it goes about it is very important as well. Mm-hmm. And that importance is not, unfortunately, it's not always recognized by Christian people. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verses 1 through 5, Paul says, I'm paraphrasing, but he says that he purposefully did not carry out his ministry in the way that the Corinthians wanted him to, because they wanted a man-centered philosophy, approach, rather than a God-centered one. That's what he tells them there. They wanted him to engage really in a form of entertainment for them in their day, oratory, rhetoric, persuasion. So when Paul preached, that's what they wanted to hear.
It just occurs to me, sorry, interject here, that's not too different than what we see today. That they didn't have television, they didn't have that kind of entertainment.
That's right.
And we don't see people just emphasizing oratory today, but they emphasize the kind of things that our culture does.
Exactly right. So here's a case where you take something that happened in biblical times, and then you make application of it. Though the form is different, the concept behind it is precisely the same. Yeah. And so he says in that passage, when I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom. Now, he says that because that's precisely what they were saying we want from you. Mm-hmm. He says, my message and my preaching. Notice those two things, my message and my preaching. It's not just the message. It's not just what I say, but also how I say it. My message and my preaching, the content and the method. He says, we're not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power. And then he says, here's why, verse 5, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. Now, a guy named Dwayne Litvin used to be the president of Dallas Seminary. He did his doctoral work years ago on that very passage, 1 Corinthians 2, 1 through 5. And he says that the orators that the Corinthians liked were what he calls audience-driven. They knew the desires of the audience, and they gave it to them in order to persuade them. entertain, really, in order to move the audience. Now, as an aside, for anybody listening, viewing, who would be interested in Litvin's work, he has a distilled version in an article that perhaps we can make available
Sure.
for
Yeah,
for
put it in the
folks.
notes below this. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
So you're saying a couple of things there. Then that many of the megachurches follow kind of an audience-driven philosophy,
Right.
and that the philosophy, at least, is not new, but goes back to biblical times where it's rejected.
It's rejected in the Bible. Yeah, both of those are true. Many large churches follow this approach, as I'm going to document. And yes, it was condemned by Paul in Scripture. Now, I appreciate the way you said it. Many megachurches follow this philosophy, implying correctly not every large church does this. You know, there are large churches like many of our viewers know John MacArthur or a John Piper. Piper's now retired from being the senior minister at his church, but John MacArthur's still going in his early 80s and has a very large church. Piper led a very mega church size assembly, but MacArthur does not, Piper did not follow the mega church philosophy. Likewise, going back further, someone like Charles Spurgeon. And he had a very large Baptist church in London called the Metropolitan Tabernacle in the mid-1800s. So when I refer to the megachurch, I'm talking about two things. One, yes, a very large church, but also one that follows a man-centered approach to ministry.
So if the philosophy goes back 2,000 years then, in church history, there must be examples of this before this explosion of the megachurch that we've seen in the last 40 years.
Yeah, for sure. There are definitely antecedents for what we see today in history of these large churches that have at least some things in common with today's megachurch philosophy. So we're going to talk some history and then bring it up to the present day. And I'm glad we get a chance to talk about some history because contrary to what too many believe today, knowing history is really, really important, whether it's secular history or church history. A few years ago, I taught a history class here at our church around the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. So I did a class on the Protestant Reformation, and in the introductory notes for that class, I said this about the importance of history. I have it here. So I'm going to read this. I have 4 things that make history important. First, the study of history develops an ability to anticipate trends before they occur. Historical events occur in a pendulumatic fashion, I said. That is, people tend to behave in reaction to current events. This coupled with the fact that, as historian George Santayana, he's the guy who said history repeats itself, that allows the person who has a working knowledge of history to often see that, you know, we've been here before, and then take action that's appropriate. Second, historical inquiry creates a sense of stability. One of the many dangers of our fast-paced society is the loss of historical moorings. The resultant make-it-up-as-you-go approach creates uncertainty about whether such untested methods are indeed best. Third, a recognition that our current blessings are an inheritance from previous generations should really create a humility about us. The antidote to the iconoclasm, that is tearing down what are considered icons. Really destroying tradition, though, is what that word has come to mean. And so the antidote to that, the answer to that, and the arrogance of our individualistic culture is a realization that we stand on the shoulders of people who have gone before us. And then fourthly, in light of God's providential work in history, we ought to come away from a study of history with a renewed sense of responsibility. The sovereign God has placed us in this moment of history, and so it's our awesome privilege and responsibility to pass the baton to the next generation of believers.
Yeah, I think back to church history classes in undergrad and some seminary, but in Baptist history class, learning about some of the revivals and camp meetings, tent meetings they had, and tons of people coming to Christ that resulted in the growth of churches. So that's what we're thinking of historically?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start because the history of revivals in America definitely shows the stark difference in philosophy of ministry and how it affects the way ministry is done. So in the mid-18th century, so that's the mid-1700s, there was what some of you may have heard of called the First Great Awakening. And that was led by men like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. Now, Whitefield and Edwards were men of solid, God-centered theology, and they preached that way. So like Paul in 1 Corinthians 2, they were not entertainers.
To put it mildly, Edwards, his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, it said that he read that. He just read it off the page in a monotone voice, right?
That's what I've heard as well, yeah. And so, as you point out then, these men believed really that the power was in the message, not in the messenger. So again, like Paul, they did not seek to entertain, but rather to preach. And that's a word in the New Testament that means to herald the message of the king, someone else's message, and you're simply giving it and trying to get out of the way so that the message comes loud and clear, and then watch the Lord, the king, do his work as a result. So it's in that way primarily that it's God-centered rather than man-centered, because the results are entirely dependent on God, not on the ingenuity, not on the prowess of the preacher. But that's in real contrast to another historical movement in our country, the Second Great Awakening. It was about 100 years later, led primarily by a man with a completely different philosophy from Whitefield and Edwards, a man named Charles Finney.
Yeah, this contrast is, in my mind, already very helpful.
And a lot of people don't know it, even people who may know the name Charles Finney. In fact, many of you may know Charles Finney as kind of a hero. That was the way I, for many, many years, thought of him. That's what I had heard about him.
Is that growing up in
My Pentecostal background,
circles?
that's one.
Yeah.
But even after I became a Baptist, I still heard of Charles Finney extolled. It was only later that I found out what he believed, as I'll talk about a little bit here. But he is a hero to many Christians today because he led this revival in the 1800s. But very few people know his theology and that it was frankly heretical.
Yeah.
He did not believe, for example, in original sin, that we all come into the world with a sin nature due to the original sin of our first parent, Adam. He said original sin was selfishness. That people can overcome if they make themselves a new heart. Make themselves a new heart. He taught that, and this is a quote, sin and holiness are voluntary acts of mind. So it's something you do. It's something you can turn on or not.
So the whole able to sin, able not to sin order that we've talked about here at our church, and how Adam and Eve were able to sin, able not to sin, and then after the fall, we're not able to not sin. He didn't recognize that.
He didn't. Excellent point. That's exactly right. He did not recognize that. He did not recognize total inability.
Yeah.
The Bible teaches total inability. We are dead in trespasses and sins, the Bible says. But Finney didn't recognize that. So this theology affects his philosophy, and theology always does that. He believed that preachers had an outsized role in producing revival. He said this is perhaps his most infamous quote. He said, "A revival is not a miracle. It's not dependent on a miracle in any sense. It is purely a philosophical result of the right use of means." What he's saying there is, if you do it right, revival will happen.
Yeah.
So he had these innovations, like he's the guy who came up.
I'm just thinking of the pressure of that too on the preacher.
Well,
if it's up to me.
That's right. And, a little bit later, I'm going to talk about the pressure. This is one of the reasons you see so many of these megachurch pastors falling.
Oh, yeah.
Because they have all of that. That is one of the reasons. They have all of that pressure. But yes, he puts all that pressure on himself because man-centered approach does that, puts it on the man. He's the guy, Finney, that developed what was called the anxious bench. Today, we call it the altar call. Many of our viewers and listeners might think that the Apostle Paul came up with the altar call, but he really didn't. The walking the aisle,
back in Rome.
You don't. So that's an innovation of the 1800s. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing inherently wrong, I should say, but very, very often, almost without exception, the way it's used, there is something
kind of a manipulation happening.
You get, because he's saying that, hey, we make it happen, then that's where the manipulation that some of us have seen, when you've seen, the preacher create the emotional mood,
One more
with
verse,
the music,
the
one
pianist
more
plays
verse, every
through.
head bowed, every eye closed, come to the front. And many preachers unfortunately learned that they can make that happen. They can make the result happen. Finney did that. So the anxious bench, walking the aisle, he set up the environment for his meetings to make them conducive for folks for him to get the result that he was looking for. So a man named Ian Murray wrote a book, a very helpful book if you're interested in this topic. It's called Revival and Revivalism. Now, he makes a distinction. There's revival and there's revivalism. Revival is the real thing. It's a work of God that's like the first great awakening that cannot be produced by humans. Revivalism is an approach to ministry that's designed to produce revival, like Finney did. So in that book that we have in our resource center, by the way, Ian Murray, Revival and Revivalism, but he documents the results of the First Great Awakening versus the results of the Second Great Awakening. And it is very, very enlightening to see how long-lasting and far-reaching were the results of a genuine, God-given revival through the preaching, non-manipulative kind of preaching of an Edwards and Whitefield, versus that which was manufactured and produced intentionally in the Second Great Awakening. And those results were not far-reaching and long-lasting.
Yeah. So in Finney he wasn't a pastor. He was an evangelist traveling from place to place, preaching his revivals, right?
That's right. He was an itinerant preacher, what many of us know with the title evangelist, a preacher who goes from place to place and he preaches, sometimes in churches, sometimes in tent meetings, but he did that to bring revival with him. And you don't see that in the New Testament as what an evangelist is. So this is another kind of an aside, but our very own Dr. William Combs at our church, one of our pastors, he wrote a scholarly article in a theological journal.
I thought you were going to say he used to be a traveling evangelist.
No, I would have paid to see that. But he wrote a great article many years ago on what an evangelist is in the Bible. I'll give you the Cliff's Notes version of it. It is that an evangelist was not this itinerant preacher that goes from place to place, but rather a church planter, like the Apostle Paul, that went from city to city
like
and
Ken
planted
Brown.
church.
So,
We, as
so
a matter of fact,
you're our resident evangelist.
Evangelist
and you
Ken
planted
Brown.
this
Yeah,
church.
there you go. Sounds weird because we think of evangelists as these traveling preachers,
Yeah.
and I'm not here to bash that, because the truth is I've known very good evangelists, even if I don't agree that that's the way it's supposed to go.
What is the saying? I get these jokes that pop into my head with some of the inside jokes. The evangelist who blows in, blows up, and blows out.
That's right. And really, that's the way a lot of times evangelists are used in churches. Maybe some of you have been in churches where they had evangelists.
And you could also have them in to say things you don't want to say.
That's it. The pastor doesn't want to say these things, so he has somebody from the outside come in and say things.
Come in and beat my people over the
he's
head
afraid
with this.
He's afraid to say, right? Now, we've never had an evangelist or revivalist at our church for the reasons that we've explained. But this revivalism for many churches became Sunday morning worship. So you think about what a monumental shift that is in what the gathering of God's people on the Lord's Day for worship now becomes. It becomes an evangelistic service. And to this day, in many churches, that's what Sunday morning is.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah.
People think of it as the church gathering as kind of a fishbowl where you invite the fish to come, and then the main fisherman, the pastor, throws the line out there to catch as many fish as he can. I mean, that's kind of what goes on week after week. Now, thank the Lord. Many people do come to the Lord through that. But that's not what the New Testament presents as the first day of the week, Lord's Day, Sunday gathering of God's people. And so as a result of that, that's where you got the big kind of bus routes to bring people in on Sunday mornings. If any of you, our viewers, listeners, are familiar with something called the Sword of the Lord, that's a periodical that when I first came out of my Pentecostal background as a young adult, and I was in the First Baptist Church I was ever a part of, that was a church that was very much of this sort. The bus, the Sword of the Lord, this periodical that really emphasized this evangelist approach. Many of the people who wrote in that periodical were evangelists. They advertised their ministry in there. But also the churches that were represented, that they had pages of display ads that churches would pay for to support the publication, but also advertise their church. And it was amazing how many of them advertised numbers right in it. Like how many people were saved this year, how many people were baptized, and all of that. So that was very much the emphasis. And there still is that whole part of evangelicalism that exists. We're not part of that. I'm not part of that anymore. I've been out of that for decades, but it's still there. That's where it comes from.
Yeah. Can we talk about what revivalism that we were talking about has in common then with megachurch?
Well, it has commonality with the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 2, and also with the Finney approach to revivalism. And that commonality is precisely this: it's audience-driven. In fact, the methodology used by most megachurches is what they call, so this is not my word, they call it this, seeker sensitive.
Yeah.
Which means the focus is on the audience. And in particular, presenting the preacher, the message, the entire presentation on Sunday morning in a way that's pleasing to the audience.
But we're not saying we want to be unnecessarily offensive to the audience, right? What's the difference between avoiding unnecessary offense and being audience driven or seeker driven?
Thanks. Yeah, that's right. Because we want to make sure that our viewers, listeners understand that we're not going out of our way to be offensive. The message itself, if you give it clearly, has its own offense. You know, the Bible says that it's foolishness to those who do not believe unless the Lord does a work on the heart of that individual. Well, you and I went together a couple weeks ago to a meeting of preachers, and I was privileged to be able to speak to that group about a number of topics related to preaching. One of those was preaching to the unchurched. And I said, as you'll recall, that we should indeed avoid unnecessary offense. I even listed some things we should be aware of when we're speaking to folks who aren't used to church. Like, for example, we should just know as preachers and as Christians, that one of the suspicions that non-church people have about us is that we're after their money. So just be aware of that. And so, don't talk about money all the time. Don't talk about it unless it's what's part of the passage you're going through. And even when we take the offering, we make it a point to say, don't feel obligated to give as we do this. This is something that those who are part of our church do. It's for that reason. So we're aware of that. Be aware that many people think that Christians, preachers, are holier than thou. That you think, I'm a sinner, but you're not. So say from time to time, I struggle with this. This is for me. This is for me as well. Recognize that they think that you're dumb, that you don't know how the world works. So perhaps say some things that indicate that you know a little bit more about the way the world works than perhaps they think, or that you have also experienced being out in the workaday world, not just in an ivory tower. And also that you're not angry with them. God is angry at sin, for sure. The Bible teaches that. We have to say that. But that includes us outside of Christ and the blood of Christ that assuage the anger of a holy God. But we're not angry with them, and we need to make sure that we come off in a way that communicates that. But we want to avoid, I said, you may remember 2 weeks ago, I said we need to avoid being a distraction. But that's quite different from trying to be the attraction.
Yeah. It's interesting. We did training. This reminded me of it. Training with our first impressions crews here at the church, the greeters, the welcome desk, and it was. We drew from a material in a book. In fact, I gave to each of the ministry leaders of those areas that book. And one of the core principles they taught was the gospel is offensive. Nothing else should be.
Okay.
So, don't go out of your way. There's an offense in the message built in, so don't add to it.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's 1 Corinthians 9 that talks about becoming all things to all men to see some people saved, right? So that's the kind of thing we're talking about, right?
We are, but we want to make sure that we understand what 1 Corinthians 9 means. megachurches don't just go out of their way not to distract, they go out of their way to attract. And
Gotcha.
as I'm going to point out in a minute, 1 Corinthians 9 doesn't teach that. But they use methods to attract the audience with the trappings, including the preacher. So it's no accident that the preacher is to be hip. The preacher's dresses in, the fashions on purpose. Very often is buff. I'll never be one of those guys. So
CBC is not in danger of having buff pastors.
it's all on purpose. It's all on purpose. In fact, that there's a whole intentional strategy to this. When several years ago, you can put out a spoof video. You remember this? Do you remember the Contemporvent video?
No. You have to send me a link.
Y'all
Put that in the show notes too.
Okay. Yeah, we should.
We could.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, it's funny, but it's sad. Because this thing was put together several years ago by a megachurch. I think it was Andy Stanley's megachurch.
Poking fun at themselves?
Poking fun at what they know they do. They know they intentionally do this thing. It's called Contemporvent. Contemporary. We're contemporary and we're relevant. No, we're better than both. We're both of those together. We're Contemporvent.
Wow.
The videos. So yes, we should include that link. So you ask about 1 Corinthians 9. But there's this list of things there in 1 Corinthians 9, 19 to 23. 1 Corinthians 9, 19 to 23. Paul says, yes, I've become all things to all men that I might by all means save some. But he says, to those without the law, I became as one without the law. To those with the law, as one with the law. If you look at what he was doing there, these are all things that Paul avoids in order to not distract. Not things he does so that he's the attraction. And back in chapter 2, he's already set the context for you to interpret that. He's already said that he would not make himself the attraction in 1 Corinthians 2, 1 through 5, even though that's what the audience wants. Because in doing that, it distracts from Christ. So in that preacher seminar that we went to a couple of weeks ago, I quoted a Scottish theologian and preacher from the 1800s, James Denny. He said this, no man can give the impression that he himself is clever and that Christ is mighty to save.
Wow.
That's penetrating, isn't it?
Yeah.
That you can't give the impression that it's about me. And at the same time, point to Christ as the one who's mighty to save. So I said to that group of guys, I said, this means a number of things, but it means that we should conduct ourselves in a way consistent with the desire expressed by John the Baptist. Remember what John the Baptist said? He must become greater, I must become less. That we'll use our personality, sure, but we'll use it to convey the message, never eclipse the message. We've got to be very careful about that. Mark Dever, a name that some of you may know, but Mark Dever is a preacher in D.C., Capitol Hill Baptist Church. And I heard him say years ago that, I love to laugh. I actually have, Dever said, a good sense of humor. But I tone that down when I'm preaching because he doesn't want to he's not trying to become a comedian. He's not an entertainer. And he doesn't want to become the focus. He wants the Lord to be the focus.
So you're saying most megachurches, not all, but most megachurches are based on a philosophy of giving them what they really want. It just blows my mind that you would read the Bible and come away with the...
So is that really the deal?
Yeah.
But giving them what they want in terms of the way you go about it. Yeah, explicitly so, as a matter of fact. To see that we need to see that issue, we need to go a little more into history. But this is more recent history, okay? So do we have time for it? How much, where are we at now?
We're about 28 minutes.
Oh, we're only 28. Okay.
Yeah, so we're right teetering there, depending on how much longer you want to go.
All right, let me give this then. But more recent history, 1970, there was a guy named Donald McGavran. You don't care about that name. But he wrote a book called Understanding Church Growth. And he's kind of a father of what's called the church growth movement. And in that book, and in McGavran's teaching, he taught something called the homogeneous principle. The homogeneous principle. And the idea was that you want to gather people who are in the same kind of demographics. So this homogeneous principle means you do a profile of the person that you want to reach and then tailor your methods to that person. Well, let's just stop and think about this. Let's just stop and think biblically about this. I mean, in Ephesians 2, where Paul talks about the dividing wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile being broken down. I mean, really, in their flesh, in their sin nature, did Jews really want to be with Gentiles? Did Gentiles really want to be with Jews? To bring it to our day, do black people want to be with white people? Do white people want to be with black people? Do poor people want to be with rich people? I mean, maybe if they think, but do rich people want to be with, poor people? These are all demographic things that I just cannot see, given the emphasis upon unity and diversity in the New Testament. But does it work? Of course. We all like to be around people like us.
Well, and especially it works if you consider working just I am getting people here.
That's right. So this homogeneous principle. And so one megachurch, as an example, took that then and developed and wrote about unchurched Harry and Sally. I think it was Sally, but definitely it was unchurched Harry. So, and the typical profile of the unchurched person, and they shaped their church around the tastes of unchurched. Rick Warren, who many of you will know that name, the Purpose-Driven Life, Purpose-Driven Church and Purpose-Driven Life, out in California, Saddleback Community Church, put together a profile. It was all based on this McGavran thing, Saddleback Sam, he called it. So most are using the same McGavran playbook, even if they've long forgotten who he is. So I can talk perhaps next time then about some more of that history of Willow Creek and how they did a survey in order to create the church, and it became wildly successful. Again, if you define success as getting people there.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to following up on this conversation, because this topic, and it can go in several directions, that will be very helpful, I think, for us as a church to think about. So thank you again for joining us this week. I'll put the little graphic up there again. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button and notification bell, and we will see you in our next video. If you have a question you'd like us to consider, you can send that in to our email address, info@cbctrenton.com, or text it to us at 97000.